onward with Joshua chapter 13. Okay, so it's the story again of God's people taking the land that God had promised. And in chapter 13, verse 1, here's what it says. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years. And the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years." Isn't that great? It's like, it's obvious, but God has to point out, you're old and advanced in years. And there remains yet very much land to possess. This is the land that yet remains. So God starts listing all these different places that are very difficult to pronounce. So I'm just going to skip it. And we're going to go to verse 6. Okay, so verse 6 is the tail end of the land that God is describing. All the inhabitants of the hill country, from Lebanon to some place, even all the Sidonians. I myself will drive them out from before the people of Israel. Only allot the land of Israel for an inheritance, as I have commanded you. Now therefore divide this land for an inheritance to the 9 tribes and the half tribe of Manasseh. Okay, so if you've been with us, the first 8-9 chapters of Joshua deal with the people of God taking the southern part of this land. And a lot of scholars will agree that the southern part probably took a few months, maybe 5 weeks, to completely take over those people. The northern kingdom, the northern part of the promised land, is a different story altogether. Back in Joshua 11, we actually never referred to this verse, but in Joshua chapter 11, it says this about the northern kingdoms. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. And based on biblical scholarship and just thinking about how old Joshua is and how old Caleb is after all this, a lot of scholars will think that the northern war lasted closer to 6 to 7 years. So that's where we're at. They've been fighting in the north, and God indicates that there's still more to do. There's still all this land to take, but he tells Joshua to basically take a break. He says, Joshua, I know there's all this stuff you have to do, but I want you to pause, stop the fighting, stop the conquering, and instead divide up the land. Now, for some personalities, that is a very difficult thing to do, to stop in the middle of something. For very goal-oriented people, to be told, in this journey, even though there's still a lot to do, I need you to stop and do something else, is very difficult. I try my best to live by this idea of pay now, play later. In other words, pay up front. Do the work you need to do up front, and then once that work is done, you can enjoy your free time. The students I teach tend to live by play now, pay later. In other words, I'm just going to have as much fun as I can until I really need to do the work, and then that's when I'll do the work, right? It's this idea of procrastination. But for me, I'm the opposite. I prefer to take care of all the business first and then have some free time. But God here is saying, even though there's a lot to do, stop what you're doing. Pause. Take some time to do something else. And that seems really strange, but this is actually very consistent with the rhythm that God has given to us to live by. There's a certain rhythm, a certain flow to how things should go. And it actually starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. And God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. Okay, interesting fact. This is when God is creating the world. Notice the day starts with evening. Okay, just a thought. Your day actually starts, according to Genesis, when you sleep. We think our day starts when we wake up, but the way that God had ordained the days is it starts with evening, then there's morning, and that's a day. Okay, there's a lot of reasons for that we don't want to get into. Chapter 2, verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So see, there's this rhythm. There's this idea of God created for 6 days, and then on the seventh day he rested. And what's interesting is it says that he made that day holy. Last week, we encountered the king of Kadesh, who was one of the kings that Joshua had conquered. And Kadesh literally just means being set apart, being different. So God is saying, there's these 6 days where I work, but the seventh day, there's something special. The seventh day is set aside from the other 6 days. It is holy, Kadesh. And what's kind of interesting, too, if you think about it, is a lot of religions will say that this place is holy, right? This temple is holy. This ground is holy, or they'll say this object is holy because it was touched by some holy man. But the first thing declared holy in the Bible is not a place, and it's not an object, it's a what? It's a day. And God instituted or started this rhythm even before man and woman were around for very long. In fact, he created them and then he rested. So there's this rhythm that God had set into place from the beginning of creation that we as people of God are meant to live by. There's an order, there's a rhythm. We see it again in Exodus chapter 10, or chapter 23, verse 10. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its yield. Verse 11, but the seventh year you shall let it rest. There's a rhythm. 6 years, 6 days, you work, you do what you have to do. Seventh day is different. It gets set apart. The Jewish people called this special day Shabbat, which we now in modern days translate as Sabbath. Okay, and to them, Shabbat or Sabbath was such a precious gift that when you hear Jewish people talking about this day of Sabbath, they talk of it like they're talking about a bride or they're talking about a queen. It was so special to the Jewish people. And if you think about why that might be the case, up until now, up until God had freed them, they were what? Slaves. They were slaves. Did they have a day off? No. For 7 days, all they knew was work, 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 and then all of a sudden, God says there's this special day set apart where you don't work. In fact, it is just as special, or only maybe second place, to the day in Jewish culture called Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. Now, personally, I'm not really good at taking a day off or resting. I'm very bad at resting. One time when I was in high school, I was super busy. Before smartphones, we had these things called planners, where there were calendars, and you would write your appointments in them. And a high school senior was like this thick. I thought I was so important. I had all these appointments. I had important friends to meet. I had important things to do. And I remember sitting at a coffee shop that was near this Christian college, and the waitress at the coffee shop, out of nowhere, said, "Hey, I'd like to share my quiet time, my devotional with you." I was like, okay. Right? I knew I was near a Christian college, so a lot of the workers in the cafe were Christian. And she basically opened up Hebrews 4. She said, God has been teaching me about the need to rest. And I was like, that really spoke to me, because I was getting burned out, and I was like, why am I getting burned out? I'm trying to do God's work. I'm trying to live for God. And this stranger, God had to send a stranger to share her quiet time at a coffee shop to remind me that you were created to rest. And I was very rebuked by that. We are very bad as a people at resting. As many as 1.1 million workers in Taipei last year put in more than 300 hours of overtime throughout the year. Let me make sure. Yeah, 300 hours. So the people in Taiwan, about 1 million workers in Taiwan, worked about an extra month of work that legally They're not supposed to. 50% of workers work more than 42 hours per week. Can I just get a show of hands? How many of you that work in the Taiwan business world have worked less than, if you're full-time, 40 hours? One hand. How many of you work 40 to 50 hours? Those of you that work in Taiwanese companies. Okay? More, 55. Paolo's not even on the scale. 60, right? Can I get 70? 70 going once, 70 going twice, right? There's just, we live in a culture. In fact, there's a Chinese term for this, which literally translates into bursting your liver, right? This idea of working so hard that your liver bursts. And studies show, and you don't need studies to show this, that working that much is really bad for your health. I don't need studies to tell me that, right? It's obvious. And what's interesting is there's this idea that we get kind of, I don't know about you, but some Christians get really strange when they feel like they're breaking God's commandments, right? So God commanded his people to have this rhythm, and when we break the rhythm, what we fail to understand is something in us breaks. When we break God's rhythm, we get broken. Last week we talked about the fact that if you want to know how to use your phone to its optimal capabilities, you go to the designer of the phone. Well, the designer of life is telling us that you need to set aside a day that is different from all other days. And yet, when we don't listen to the designer, we wonder why we have health problems. We wonder why we as a people are stressed out. We wonder why we as a people, our lifespans are reduced. There's a rhythm. The most obvious thing to do for Joshua would be to take the land and say, God, why don't we take care of all this and then we'll rest? That seems the most efficient thing to do, but God invites them instead, let's pause in the middle of all this and let's rest. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I just want to talk about this idea of Sabbath, this idea of Shabbat, and kind of explore what it is and what it isn't. The first time that people are really commanded is in the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20. God says this, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In every commandment, there is a thou shalt, like you shall do this, and there is a thou shalt not, you shall not do this. And in this commandment, where we see the thou shalt not, is it says you shall not do any work. But I want to emphasize that Sabbath is not about work or not work. Okay, it has nothing, it's the essence of Sabbath is actually not about whether you work or not. Because what started happening is the Jewish people that wanted to follow this, they started asking the question, well, what counts as work? For a physicist, work is, anyone know? Force times distance. Right? To a worker is picking up this pen that's, why is this pen here? Is picking up this pen, is that work? Okay, so they started wondering what work was because they wanted to be careful to not violate the Sabbath. So the rabbis, the teachers, decided to come up with 39 categories of what is work. And within those 39 categories, they came up with 1,500 rules for what you could not do during Sabbath. And they were crazy. In other words, they would say, you can't walk this far, but if you take an extra step, that's work. So what if you have walked that far and you need to get home? You can't go back? There are literally rules that you couldn't spit on the ground Because if you spit on the ground, then someone planting seeds there, that seed might take your spit and use it to grow. So you'll be doing work. It's crazy, right? There's this idea, there's actually written down that if you leave your farming tool on your bed, you could not pick it up because that would be work. So you had to sleep with your farming tool. And modern day Jewish people and even some Christians take it as far as, I know some families that do this, they can't turn an oven on and off on Sabbath because that's work. I had a friend whose parents would not go to the gas station and fill up gas because they thought that was work. But Jesus comes along and reminds people that it's not about work. Okay, this is what happens in Mark chapter 2. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain, right? They're taking grain. That's work. No good. 24, and the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him." Verse 27, and he said to them, "Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath." So what is Jesus saying? Jesus is saying, you've missed the point. You're making it seem like the people need to serve this day. They need to fulfill the rules of this day. But Jesus is saying the Sabbath day was made for the people, not that the people were to obey the rules of the day. It was for the good of the people. But instead of being a benefit, because they had all these rules, you can't do this, you can't do that, it became a burden instead of the blessing. It's not about work. Can you turn to your neighbor and say, it's not about work? Wow, I sense the excitement. Okay. So what is it? Okay. The word in Hebrew, Shabbat, literally means to rest and stop and pause because something was completed. So the first time we see it is where God, after completing his creation, he rests, he Shabbats, he pauses, he enjoys. So it's not about work, it's actually about pausing. It's about reflecting. It's about enjoying what you did. I mean, think about this. For many years, all they've been doing is fighting. They never had a chance to sit back and actually enjoy what they had accomplished. But God is giving them a day to say, stop, take a step back, enjoy, reflect, recenter your lives. That's quite a gift. We need this, don't we? We need this day. Think about our culture. Our culture is constantly about moving faster, being more efficient, getting ahead, fulfilling your to-do list, doing more, and we're always so rushed that I don't know if we ever take a day to stop and pause and reflect. Think about Costco. How many have been to Costco on a Saturday? Okay? That may be where the devil is. Right? If you've ever been to Costco on a Saturday, it is so crowded. So what do? Because you are rushed. Your culture tells you you got more important things to do. What do? You take your cart and you survey the lines. And you see, right? You don't just see which line is shortest. You actually have a formula, don't you? You see, okay, which line is the shortest, but that's not enough. You look at the people's carts to see how much stuff is in the carts, because just because it's a short line, if this person is buying like all this seaweed, which seems to be popular, it's going to take a long time. And then you also judge based on which checkout person is the fastest. And based on all of that, you make your decision. And you stand in line and you get aggravated if the line next to you starts moving faster. Right? Why is that? It's because we're in this world where it's all about do the next thing, move further ahead, take care of business, be efficient, be productive. And God is saying, just pause. If we're wondering, like, what should I do? What's lawful? What does God want me to do? What does God not want me to do? You've missed the point. Okay, that day is a day for a people that are constantly pushed and defined by their accomplishments to just take a step back. And it's very healthy. There was a church, and on one of their retreats, they gave the people 6 hours of silence. And 90% of the people hated it. They came out of that 6 hours and they're like, I didn't hear God at all. I'm just more frustrated. I'm more confused. That was such a waste of time. And there was another group that did get a lot out of that 6 hours. And you know why 90% probably didn't like it? It's because we're just not good at sitting in silence and taking a step back. I don't know about you, but anytime I have silence and time to think and reflect, 100 things start popping into my mind of what I have to do, what I have to take care of, what's coming up. Maybe that's just me. But it's not about what work we do or don't do. It's about pausing to reflect and to enjoy. Second thing, it's not about us. It's about Him. Turn to your neighbor and say, it's not about us. It's not about us. Okay? Can we go back to Exodus 20? One of the first words in Exodus 20 that God commands when He commands the people is it says, remember the Sabbath day. Now the word for remember, zakor, right? That word remember is not actually just referring to the Sabbath day. It's referring specifically also to remembering God. So this idea is Sabbath is not about us taking a day off. It's not about us resting from our work. It's a day about us actually remembering God. If you think back to last week, this is Joshua chapter 13. Joshua chapter 12. Anyone remember what it was, what the content was? It was a list of what? All these conquered nations. And then we get to the point where God says, pause. Why would God have to list these kings? All these 33 kingdoms. It's because God was telling Israel, remember and reflect on what I helped you do. In other words, remember the journey I've taken you through, and then God says, okay, let's have a Sabbath. Because up until then, they haven't had a proper place to actually sit down and have a proper Sabbath, because they've been traveling and fighting. So what does Jewish Sabbath look like? It was actually a day of celebration. And what they would do is, in the morning, sometimes they would have a service like we're having now in the afternoon. They would celebrate. They would dance. Okay, that's kind of weird. That seems like work. But they would dance. Why? Because they're remembering joy that God gave them. They would tell stories to their children about all the great things God did. They would, as a family, maybe read Scripture to remember what God did. So Sabbath was not about us. Sabbath was actually delighting in God. It was about centering our lives around God. It wasn't a day off so that we could be more efficient the other days of the week. It was a day to step back, to pause, to enjoy. But that enjoyment can't just come from the fact that I get a free day. That enjoyment has to come from the fact that you're thinking about God. You're remembering God. You're recentering your life about what God did. You're building up your faith. It's really about a day of emptying and filling. It's a day where we empty ourselves of accomplishment, of drivenness, of schedules, of to-do lists, of this race to get on top, of this idea to keep pushing forward for more and more, to make yourself more efficient, to make yourself a better worker, to have more success. It's a day to get rid of all that and instead be filled with joy, with peace, be filled with God, be filled with faith in remembering what God did. It was not about us being the center of the day. It was always, in the Jewish culture, about God. But ultimately, here's what I want to end with. Ultimately, it's about obedience, isn't it? Because it takes a lot of faith to stop what you think needs to be done. It takes a lot of faith to take a step back and maybe say that this next thing on my list is not as important as pausing and trusting God, pausing and enjoying God. Exodus chapter 16. The people of God are not yet in the promised land. They're in the wilderness, in the desert. And it says this in verse 22. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is the day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till morning." So they laid it aside till morning, as Moses had commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Verse 25, Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." What is going on? So in the middle of the desert, God's people had no food. So what God would do is he would provide this flaky substance that would come up like the dew in the ground. And they called it manna, which literally means, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. It's like, oh, there's this flaky substance that looks like food. What is it? Oh, let's call it that. Okay, so they would get this food, but the command was only gather what you need for that day. But some people felt that doesn't make any sense. What if this doesn't come tomorrow? So they would gather more than 1 day's worth, and what would happen is this bread from heaven, there would be worms. It would rot. So God's command to the people while they were walking through the desert is pretty much go to bed with nothing. That is a lot of faith and obedience. Go to bed without food for tomorrow. In other words, he is saying, trust that just as I provided today, I will also provide tomorrow. But there was one exception. The exception was the day before Sabbath, the sixth day. The sixth day, God told them to gather twice as much, so that on Sabbath day, they didn't have to worry about gathering bread and manna. They just had to focus on God. And so ultimately, what is Sabbath? Sabbath is this declaration that I can trust God. Sabbath is this declaration that I have enough. That what I think I need, I actually don't need. Because God set it up that they would have enough for that day. Because for that day, they need to understand that I don't need all this stuff. I don't need this food. All I need is God. So ultimately, Sabbath is this trust. It is this exercise in obedience. To know that even though we're not working, we're setting aside time for God that maybe we feel we could set aside for our own professional advancement. Do we trust God, who maybe got us that job to keep us in that job? Do we trust God, who provided that job for us to give us favor, even though we're taking some time off for Him instead of focusing just on work? Joshua 13, God says this, I myself will drive them out. God's reminding people, Joshua, you can take a break. Because you know why you can take a break? Is because I'm going to take care of the rest. You know why you can take a break from gathering food? Is because I'm going to provide enough food for you for that day where you rest. It's about trust. In fact, I was talking with Jeff the other week, and we were talking about how this whole book of Joshua is about obedience. Are you going to trust a God who tells you to cross a river when it's flowing at flood stage? Are you going to trust a God who tells you to walk around a city 7 times, blowing trumpets? How crazy is that? Are you going to trust a God who tells you to fight this army that is hundreds of times bigger than your army? Are you going to trust a God that tells you in the midst of your busy day, stop, pause, focus on me? That's really what it comes down to. Are you going to trust that God? The word for rest is actually tied in, biblically speaking, to the word for salvation. We see it in Hebrews 4, and we also see it in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 15. For thus says the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, He has said, in repentance and rest you will be saved. In quietness and trust is your strength. So in other words, there is this intimate connection between the word rest and the word salvation. Because guess what? If our God is able to save us, then isn't He able to take care of the things that we feel we need to take care of, but instead He commands us to not worry for a day? If our God can beat sin, can't He take care of our jobs and our to-do list? I think He can. But the worst part of that verse is the end, but you are not willing. So here's what it comes down to. Right, we as a church are not a very in-your-face church. But we have to be confronted with this question. Are we willing to set aside time, maybe a whole day? I mean, traditionally it was a whole day, where God is the whole focus of that day. Where we push aside what tasks we have. We push aside what worries us. We push aside the things that we think will complete us, the things that we think will help us feel secure, and just acknowledge that, God, I don't need this extra stuff. I just need you to complete me. And God, even though this seems impossible, I'm still going to surrender it into your hands. That's the essence of Sabbath. Not about stopping work. It's not just about pausing and reflecting, but it's pausing and reflecting focused on a God who is asking you to lay down all your burdens and worries and trust Him. That's rhythm. That's the rhythm God has designed. If we are stressed, if we have no peace, you got to ask yourself, are we out of rhythm? Are we not obeying God's rhythm? So here's what we're going to do. Okay? Can I have Jeff and Kevin? We're gonna pass out a slip of paper and some pens. If you have a pen, then just use your own pen. And we're gonna take some time to reflect, okay? The other side of the paper, don't mind it. It's my sermon notes from the past 4 or 5 weeks. I just cut them out, okay, to reuse. So don't be like, oh, what is this? Okay, so it's just scratch paper. But I want us to write down the answer to these 2 questions. Lee, can we put up that slide? To the questions, okay? Next one. Okay? What are the things you're worried about? Okay? What are the things that are on your mind that you feel like you can't let go? Whether it's your finances, whether it's work-related, relationship-related, there are things that we feel like God cannot take care of and we have to take care of. What are those things? Just write it down. Don't edit it. No one's going to read it, okay? I promise you, nobody's going to read it. Okay? On purpose, at least. And then secondly, what are these things that you think will complete your life? That you know won't, right? Like with the manna, they felt that having enough manna would help them feel secure. That having enough provisions would help them feel secure. But God is saying, trust me. Trust that I will provide enough for you. What are those things that we think, man, if I just had 10,000 more US dollars, I'd be really happy? Because I think that the answer to these questions are the things that prevent us from taking a day or taking some time, taking maybe even just an hour, and just, instead of being defined by our accomplishments, just being defined by whose child we are. So just take a moment. We're not going to have any music. I want us to actually do this in silence. And then when you're done, I want us to just, can you help me move this? I want us to just put it in the prayer box, okay? Not that we're going to pray over it, because Carvel would be there for hours, okay? But it's just this symbol of, God, there are these things that I feel like I need to take care of and I can't take time off from, but I trust you with it. Okay? And I'm not going to read it. Nobody's going to read it. I don't know, we'll maybe ceremonially burn it while chanting or something. But just put it in the box as a symbol of letting it go. And then maybe we'll close in one last song. So let's do this in silence. And then once the praise team, music team is ready, maybe come up and lead us in one last song.
I come to you, for I know you satisfy. I am empty, but I know your love does not run dry. So I wait for you. So I wait for you. I'm falling on my knees, offering all of me. Jesus, you're all this heart is living for. Broken, I run to you, for your arms are open wide. I am weary, but I know your touch restores my life. So I wait for you. So I wait for you. I'm falling on my knees, offering all of me. Jesus, you're all this heart is living for. I'm falling on my knees, offering all of me. Jesus, you're all this heart is living for.
That was actually pretty quick, so I think we all knew, right? And hopefully that was freeing for some of you. But what I would encourage you is, because it's a process, putting it in a box is not going to make the worries go away automatically, right? So let's make an effort as a community this week to set aside some time, maybe a whole day, where that day is just all about God. All day is maybe wrestling with this and bringing it before God and saying, God, I'm really having trouble letting go of these things, of my future, of the things I worry about. And maybe let's start building a habit of setting aside this holy time where God can just be a father. And instead of us being workers or students, instead of us being successful or unsuccessful or behind or ahead, we can just be His children. Let's pray, and then we'll be out of here. God, we just thank you that you have built into the rhythm of our lives a day where we can recenter. God, when the week comes and messes us all up and gets us all out of focus and piles on all these things that stress us out and piles on all these worries and all these disappointments, that God, you built into the rhythm a day where we can step back and instead of worrying, just enjoy you and enjoy being your child and enjoy you loving us, God. And forgive us for being a people that have pushed that aside as being inefficient or being unnecessary. God, forgive us for being a people that feel like we don't need that day or that time to recharge and be recharged by our Father. And I pray that you would give us the strength and the wisdom and the opportunities and the discipline to set aside a time as holy for you and say, God, this is your time to be remembered. This is your time for me to have joy in you. This is your time to be worshiped. This is your time to help me release all these stresses and burdens. We thank you. Continue the good work that you started in us. In Jesus' name, amen.